my great honor to welcome all of you for joining this seminar organized by the Center for Language and Literacy Education. Today we are very honored to have Professor Wang Chuang as our guest speaker for this seminar. Okay, Professor Wang has many different titles and identities. Okay? He is a full professor of educational research, measurement, and evaluation. He is the chair of the Department of Educational Leadership at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And he's also the former dean of our faculty, right? Okay? And he's a very productive academic researcher and writer. He has published more than 8 books, 22 book chapters, and over 200 peer-reviewed journal articles in top tier journals in the field. And he's also the top two scientist worldwide by Stanford University. And he's also the associate editor of psychology in the schools. And Professor Wang's research is really multidisciplinary in nature, and his expertise focuses on quantitative research methods, English language learners' self-efficacy beliefs, and self-regulated learning strategies. So in this afternoon, Professor Wang would like to share his recent research on the measurement of self-efficacy beliefs in language acquisition. Okay, now let me pass it to Professor Wang. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Yi, for your introduction. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to give a lecture to the Faculty of Education, which is my home. I've been working here for like 5 years, 4 years. So I worked here for 4 years as the former dean of the Faculty of Education, but I never had a chance to give a lecture to our students or faculty. So this is a very good opportunity for me. I really appreciate that. So I hope you will like it. So this is part of my research, as Professor Yi has mentioned. I have done really multidisciplinary research. That's also due to the nature of my major. So my major in the doctoral program is educational research, focused on quantitative research method. So my master's degree is statistics. So that's put me on a high demand because I have to collaborate with a lot of colleagues across disciplines, writing grant proposals and writing publications, etc. That's why I got involved in many topics. So, but self-efficacy is my major concentration because part of my training in a PhD program is about self-efficacy and self-regulation. So, Barry Zimmerman, who is a very big name in self-regulation field, he was the professor of my professor. So that's why we have some connections. That's why I'm interested in the self-regulation field. Of course, this is part of my dissertation. I'll introduce you why I got interested in this topic and how I carried on this research for more than 25 years. So it's been a long journey. So I want to talk about the process of instrument development. I know that many of you are interested in developing an instrument. I do not encourage doctoral students to develop an instrument, but I do see the value of that. It's when necessary, you probably need to develop your own instrument. So I will talk about the purpose and form of instrument, which is very important, why you want to develop this instrument. And you have defined population. I'll talk about method theory and Ken theory. They both focus on interpretation and use of the skills of the test. You don't develop a test or skill just because you need it or just because there's no instrument available. You have to look at the purposes of who are you serving. And then I'll talk about the theory-based definition of the construct. So you need some content knowledge. For example, in order to measure self-efficacy, you have to know what self-efficacy means, and then the theoretical framework related to self-efficacy. And you also need to conduct cognitive interviews. That's also why qualitative research is very important. As I mentioned, my master's degree is statistics, and my doctorate degree is quantitative research method. But I have taken 3 qualitative research classes because of this. Because my advisor said, in order to develop an instrument, you have to conduct cognitive interviews. If you don't take this qualitative research class, you cannot know. You don't know how to conduct interviews. The quality study is also very, very complicated. Not just ask some questions. So you have to know follow-up question. You have to know the purpose of the way, purpose to ask questions, the way you ask questions, how you phrase the questions. That is very complicated. That's why cognitive interview is also very important. And then you can also conduct expert interviews. So because nobody is expert on every field, so you have to collect a group of experts, and then they will review the items and just talk about whether it has content related. Some people call face value, but it's content related, it's more often. And then you have to talk about the items. So I'm going to move on quickly. I know that this is a huge topic. I try to cover it within 40 minutes, as Professor Yu told me, and then we can have some more discussions. You can all ask me questions. You have quite a lot of experience on developing instruments and related to that, so you can ask me good questions related to the process, not necessarily on this topic, because the process of developing and validating instruments is the same, regardless of what content it is. So first of all, you need to consider the purpose. As I mentioned that you gather some information, so what construct measure, and then for writing the items, you have to ensure the validity, content validity, and you have to minimize the item non-responses. That means if you are collecting data, you want people to respond to your items. You don't want people to skip the items. You don't want people to respond without seriously stopped. And then you also want to minimize your measurement error. So these are the things you have to consider when you are writing the items. For the weighting scales, you also need to consider whether you want to use unipolar scales or bipolar scales. So the bipolar scale is very positive, is very popular because it is strongly disagree and strongly agree. So you're on the one hand, you're negative, on the other one, you're very positive. So unipolar scale actually becomes more popular because it's closer to the ordinal scale. For example, from a lack of attribute to a high level of attribute. For example, frequencies, you can say seldom, rarely, and then often, etc. So this is different ways to write the scales. And then you also have to consider the response options, whether you want a 5-legged scale or 6 or 7, so you can do even or odd number. So there's the pros and cons to have even number or the odd number choices. For example, there's been a lot of discussion about whether you need to keep a middle. Like if you use 5-point-legged scale, the 3 means unsure, right? I don't know. So whether it's good or not to keep that option. So there's a lot of discussion. You can search for the literature. So there are pros and cons for each option. I want to summarize some basic, very important things that you need to remember. First of all, be specific. So be specific means you want to keep it very focused on what you're trying to measure. You don't want the item to be vague, to be broad, because then people really don't know what they are measuring. You want to include the definitions if necessary. If you are measuring a certain concept that people are not very familiar with, for example, people now, they are kind of familiar with self-efficacy, but I think many people confuse the concept of self-efficacy with self-confidence. So even now, I review a lot of articles, people still get confused with the difference between self-confidence and self-efficacy. For example, when you measure self-efficacy, you cannot use the term confident. You cannot say, I'm confident about this. So this is definitely wrong to measure self-efficacy. So you need to provide some definition of the key terms. If you, well, of course, you do not want to have a lot of key terms, but the major term you need to provide definition. You also want to avoid double-barred items. You also want to avoid double negatives. I'll give you examples. So these are probably very common knowledge. Again, the most important is use a profit reading level. So if, yes.
Quick question about readability level. Is there any official or more representative scale of readability?
Yeah, I will talk about that in a few minutes. Good question. Yes, you need to pilot. So that's why pilot is very, very also important. The process is very long, so that's why I told you I've spent more than 20 years on that. So yes, for the reading level, for example, when I was doing my dissertation, I was targeting elementary school students. So for elementary, I also was targeting ESL students, English and second language students. But English as second language elementary school students, you want to make sure they understand the English on items. So you have to get a group of students for a pilot, and then you have to see whether they can understand it. And recently, I developed another skill for high school students. I use my daughter's classmates. So I asked my daughter to distribute the instrument to her classmates. And then I actually asked them to revise my item because they told me that I'm very old-fashioned, I'm an old man. So they said, we don't use that language anymore. I said, okay, so what language do you use? So the high school students, they create some new terms. So that's why you need to make sure, not only the reading level, but also you want to use their language so that they can understand what they're talking about. They don't want to read the language which is, my daughter always criticized my writing. She said my writing is too formal. She said my writing is academic writing. But she said, that's not the language we use in high school. So I said, okay. I said, okay, I'll take your advice. So that's why this is very important. So I'll give you some examples. For example, this one, you will say, to what extent are your measures of progress quantitative and objective, right? So quantitative and objective are different things. So not all quantitative are objective, and not all objectives are quantitative. So you cannot measure two things in one item. So you can split them into two items. And then for double negatives, you cannot say that the course will not improve my knowledge of the subject. So because this is double negative, so even though you think, oh, there's nothing wrong with that, I understand the sentence. Problem is when you are responding to a survey, if a survey consists of like 50 or 60 or 100 items, people don't have that much patience to read that carefully. They usually misread it. You don't want people to misread it so that it can cause noise in the data. When your data are not bad, when your data are wrong, they're not good quality, it causes you a problem in your analysis of the data and even hurt your results. So you better just say straightforward, the course improves my knowledge of the subject. So in one word, you are collecting data. You are asking people to help you to respond to your items. You want to make the job other people to answer your questions easy. You don't want to create more barriers. You don't want to make it too complicated. You want to make it as simple as possible, as straightforward as possible. All right, so these are some tips about writing items. I would like to introduce you to the concept of Messick's framework of construct validity. So Messick published this work in the 1990s. So this is a very old work. I still quote this work. I still cite this work. Actually, I'm writing still too. Sometimes the reviewers question me why you're still citing this work. I'll talk about it in a few minutes. I say because this is still a good framework. So unfortunately, if you read even nowadays, you read some articles, people still use old terms like discriminative validity, concurrent validity, test validity, etc. So these are terms, of course, I'm not saying they're wrong, it's just different schools. I'm in this school, I don't use those terms. So Messick has 6 aspects of content of validity. One is called content, another called substantive, and the third one is structural, and then generalizability, external, and consequential. I'll talk about each one of them in a few minutes. Michael Kent is also another big name in validity. Michael Kent focuses on the interpretation and use of the item, of the score, of the test score. He said that you develop scores for the purpose of people have to interpret the result and use of the scores. They're also different. Interpretation and use are different. Use is more consequential. It's similar to Messick's consequential aspect of validity. For example, Chinese Gaokao. Gaokao is a high-stake test, right? So how do we use Gaokao scores? We use Gaokao scores for entrance to Ivy League schools in China, like Tsinghua, Beida, etc. So these are high stake, and some people lose the opportunity to have higher education experience due to the low score in Gaokao. So these are high stake tests. So the use of the test is very, very important. Whether it's valid to use Gaokao to select top students for Ivy League schools, that's a question we need to examine. And then interpretation means if you have a score of this high, what does that mean? For example, if I take a math test, if I score 99 out of 100, does that mean that I'm almost perfect in mathematics skills? So that's interpretation of the test. So so Ken used the term, it's called IUA, it's called interpretation use argumented. So he focuses more on the argument-based approach. A group of scholars follow him as well. Of course, this is also controversial. So Ken also wrote an article in the Journal of Educational Measurement. So he had a very good discussion with some other scholars. He disagreed with some of them, he agreed with some of them. So this is why, this is academic scholarship is a healthy discussion. We don't have to agree with each other, but we can argue with each other. I can stand on my foot, and I'll tell you why I stand on my foot. You can tell me about why you stand on your foot. We can have a very friendly conversation. So I don't mean that either I'm wrong or you are wrong. It's just healthy conversation so that we can all realize our weakness, so that we can improve our skills. So, so Michael Ken means that interpretation and use are equally important, but they are different. They are used for decision makings, for example, selection, sharpness, like IQ tests, whether you're smart or not smart. Actually, IQ tests were developed for military tourism at first. So I don't know if you know this history or not. So IQ, U.S. military, they want to put soldiers who are smart. The reason is this. Their philosophy is that soldiers have to make decisions on the battlefield. So in their definition, the best soldier is not the soldier who follows orders all the time. Of course, you need to follow orders. All the soldiers have to follow orders. But there are some situations in the battlefield which you lose communication with your higher rank officer. Then you have to make a decision right on the spot how to save your life. So this is why they need people who are smart. That's why IQ tests were developed originally to select people for the military services. So that's the governance of intelligence. And then you have some places like college, between different levels. So APA, American Educational Research Association, APA, American Psychology Association, NCME, National Council of Measurement and Evaluation. These are the three very major associations, academic associations in the US. And they work together in 2014. They developed a handbook. It's called validity testing validity. So that handbook, I think I heard the rumor that they are developing a new version, but I haven't seen it yet. So people are talking about it. The new version might come out soon. So this is the place that I was questioned a lot, because when I was writing article, I did cite Messick. I did cite this one. So they always ask me, why do you cite Messick? So you can tell, AEA, ATA, NCME, they focus on 5 aspects of construct. So if you compare that with Messick's framework, they're almost identical. And as they come from Messick, and we cite Messick as well. So that's why there's no reason for you not to cite the original source and cite the second source. So that's why I always keep citing Messick, even though some reviewers don't like it. They said it's too old. I said, oh, it's original. So, okay, so that's why you don't always have to agree with reviewers. If you provide strong reason, reasonable, you don't want to argue with them, but I think it's okay. All right, so let's talk about each aspect for the content. But the content, Michael Ken is also very strong supportive of content validity. He said that it should be at the beginning of developing an instrument. When you develop an instrument, you have to know what content you want to measure, right? So what's the purpose? What's the population you are going to serve? So that's why you need to see the content of a text or the content of a survey with the construct that you are intended to measure. And you also need to see the items, whether they are representative, whether they are relevant, or whether they are appropriate. So these need expert review. So you need the method you use logical analysis. So I think in educational writing, I don't know if you agree with me or not. I know you took a lot of classes on academic writing and read a lot of journal articles. To me, I know you how to write literature, right? You all know how to write literature. to me, I will tell you my experience is the best article is written has logical thought. Logic is the most important. When you read a good article, the logic flows. And when you read it, everything comes out as you expected. Because when you read the first paragraph, you know what's going to come in the second paragraph. When you read the second paragraph, you know what's coming in the third paragraph, because the logic follows. So the bad article is you don't know what, you always give you a surprise. So you don't know what the author is trying to lead you to. You don't know, even though the good language, with wonderful English language, vocabulary, structure, grammar, etc., it's hard to follow. That means it's not logical. And also good article tell you a story. Even though academic writing is also a story. So when you read a good article, you know what kind of story they're telling. The research questions come out naturally because when you read introduction, you know what research question is going to come out. When you read the literature review, you know the literature review. Every piece of the review you review will have a connection with the research question. So that's what I mean by logical and narrative. So that's also why logical analysis is very important in developing instrument as well. So you need empirical analysis, you also need expert judgment, which I talked about before. Some people call them DIFAC, Delphic method, or company related. So there's a method that I use called CVR, it's called content validity ratio. So this is the example I did. So recently I got another grant. So I work with other people. So I got a grant with National Science Foundation. And recently I got another grant from Spencer Foundation. It's also a very big foundation in the US. So our goal is to develop an instrument to measure micro-credentials. Micro-credential, I don't know how many of you have heard of the term micro-credential? Micro-credential. You know credit, right? Credit means you take a course, you earn credit. Micro-credential, micro means small, M-I-C-R-O. You know certificate, right? You know degree. So now you
Sarah or EDX considered micro-credential?
Uh-huh.
Like they finish a 4-week classes
Yes.
and then get a certificate?
You're on, yes, exactly. So this is popular in the US now. So the reason is, the people always talk about, the economy is not so good. People always talk about invest on return. How much I invest, how much I get return. So getting a PhD degree, I know how many of you are PhD students, right, doctoral students, it's costly. Right? You spend 5 years, 4 years. And University of college is very generous. You get, I think most of you get scholarship, but some of you don't. You have to pay. So it's costly for education. Degree is very expensive. And certificate is cheaper, but still more expensive. So the most economy way that in the US they're talking about is micro-credential. Micro-credential is just exactly what that student said. You take a few courses. And you don't get a degree, you don't get a certificate, you just get a credit. It's a micro-credential. You get a credit, and that credit is recognized by the university. It's also, most importantly, is recognized by the industry. So when people hire people, they don't need a degree. They only need some people with credit. For example, AI. AI is popular, right? So if I need someone with AI background, if you take a few courses that meet the requirement of my job duties, you're fine. So that's why micro-credential become more famous. That's why we got funded. We got funded because we are developing micro-credential courses, and we are developing instruments to measure. Micro-credential is also offered as completely online, so no face-to-face classes. So that's why you can enroll students from all over the world. And then the uniqueness is that people take online courses, and then what's the intention to take online courses? And what's the graduation rate? What's the completion rate? What's the success rate? And what are the factors that impact the graduation rate? That's why we are developing it. That's how we got funded. So we got I think maybe about 100 items. So it's quite a long survey. So we put them all the items together. We pay every expert $200. We ask them to rate. We ask them to rate whether this item is important, or very important, or not important, or somewhat important. So they have to rate them in 3 categories. So we invited 20 experts. So every expert would pay $200. And we asked them to rate them, and then we copy them to see how many of them are, if they agree with each other. So that will help us to decide the content of it. So this is our results. So you can see these are question number, and then these are the number of essentials, this is the percentage of agreement. So that's how we develop the first step of the content book. What about response process? Response process is cognitive process. So we use analysis of individual responses. So the IRT model helps, and MRI also helps. I know some of you use MRI on the University of Macau has a very good MRI machine. It can see your eye tracking, and also see your brain, your neural system. You can also look at your response time. So unnecessarily all you call this one, and the relationship of the parts of the test. So this is the example of MRI. I'm not expert at all. Professor Zhang is the expert, so I'm not going to talk about that. I might be wrong. So this is just tell you how the brain functions when you are reading an instrument. So, for example, self-efficacy does. Self-efficacy, when you read something which is easy, you probably your brain functions like it's not stressed at all. Or something is hard, you might cause some difficulties. So the internal structure is the one that used a lot. So I'm very disappointed to say that I read like 100 out of 100 articles I read, maybe 60 or 70 articles only talk about reliability and internal. And they think that's validity. That's actually not. That's just the structure. The structure is right, but that does not necessarily mean the content is right. So that's why what I'm writing a proposal for a special issue of validity. So hopefully we'll get it. Our call for proposal come out in the fall. So I hope you can contribute. I'm going to guest editor a special issue for the psychology schools focus on validity. Because I see the need. That people, even though Massive published in 1995, and many people, when they publish articles, when they cite instrument, they only report reliability and internal validity, which is the CFA, confirmative factor analysis. People think that that's good enough. No, that's not good enough. That's only one of the 6 aspects. So that's why I think there's a need to do that. So that's why CFA is good, and DIF is also good, but only talks about the structure, the structure. So whether the structure meets what's the design, it's always say that what the data is the model. And then for the relationship to the other variables, so there's a subcategory of convergent evidence or discriminant evidence. So they all belong to the categories of evidence of based on relationship to other variables. So this means convergent means, but in theory, if the 2 variables are supposed to be related, your data support that relationship. And discriminant means, in theory, they should not be related to each other, and your data support that no relationship or no significant relationship. So the method is very common: correlation, the Pearson correlation, or regression. So, and then the internal structure, you can also. And then you can see about consequences of the test. I talked about a little bit in the previous slide about interpretation and the use of the test scores, and also what the claim that you made about the test use are sometimes not directly based on test score interpretations. So that's sometimes the consequences that are not unintended. For example, dog count. So dog count is a very sensitive topic. So I think Professor Jiang published some articles on that. So it's very sensitive because the results sometimes are not very encouraging. So, but you have to think about the consequences of publishing that result. So that's why we have to be careful about the I'm sure that the consequence of dog count is very complicated. So that's not the topic of today. So I'm not going to go too much about that. But it just gives you a hint. So the test scores are sometimes high stake. You have to be careful about what the consequences are, how people interpret and how people use the test scores. Okay, the generability is also a very important factor. Again, you can see that many people just borrow other people's instrument. For example, my self-efficacy instrument I got emails almost every week. People are very polite. They want to use my instrument. They send me an email, ask me for my permission to use that instrument. I always say yes. I always give them different versions. And my instrument is now in many languages like Chinese, German, Spanish, Arabic, Korean, Vietnamese. I have different versions of my instrument. People translate them into different languages. I always give them condition. For example, they're also Turkish. So I also get a lot of requests on Turkey. I don't know why. So many Turkish people ask me, I always say, I have a version. I give them the version. I said, if you update it, please send me a copy. I want to keep all different versions so that in the future, if some other scholar want to use it, I would like to share that with other people. But they don't have to translate themselves because sometimes the meaning could be lost during the translation. I want to save them time. I also want to make sure the content is not lost. So that's why you have to, the translation process, people use back translation. Back translation is the basic method. You translate from one language to another language, but that's not enough. That's only the first step. So after back translation, you also want to pilot it. You want to make sure that people responses are the same because even though sometimes by culture are different, Chinese people, American people, and European people, when they read the same item, even though the language is the same, even though you translate into different languages, people's culture are different, their interpretation, their reaction is also different. So that's why you need to do this invariance test called measurement invariance. So I'll show you an example in a few minutes. It's called differential item function. So whether each item functions the same across different populations. That's why when you use an instrument that was originally developed in another country or another culture, you want to make sure you follow this process to make sure you have this aspect of construct. Okay, so this is summary of basics framework with the standards published by AERA, APA, and NCIP. You can see that's why I think it's almost identical. They call them differently, but they reduce that from 6 max to 5 max. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my instrument. You can see I'm old because I graduated in 2004. So I think many of you probably are not born yet. So that was in my dissertation. And then I developed with 4 dimensions with sub-alphabets for listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The reason I was interested in this topic was I was a teacher of English in China before coming to the US for a doctorate degree. So I'm interested in teaching of English language myself. And the second reason was my son was at the elementary school at that time. So my son was an ESL student. I'm very selfish. I always talk about, do service and do study, but also help my family. So that's why, why not? It doesn't conflict, right? So I'm doing my research, which is legitimate, and also helping my family. So there's no conflict. So my son was struggling because he was born in China. I brought him to China. I brought him to the US, but English was not his first language. So he was struggling in learning English as a second language. I said, well, let's focus on this one. So at that time, my son was like 10 years old. So that's why I was helping him. So, and I know that for English, you have listening, speaking, reading, and writing, the 4 important skills. So I developed 8 items for each of the 4 dimensions, so altogether 32 items. The targets are the ESL, we call it English Language Learner, or ELL. They don't call them second language, because in the US, it can be the 3rd language, or 4th language, or whatever. They're very multilingual society. I use 7 for language skill because it's the exploratory process. I will show you why I want to use 7 instead of 5. Okay, the theory was based on Bandura's theory of self-advocacy, and I have 4 young Chinese ELLs and 4 experts in assessment and second language. That's how I developed the content. And then I conducted interviews. I also conducted observations. So these two you are very familiar with. Like interviews, ask questions, observation, we observe their behavior. And the verbal protocol is something maybe some of you know, some of you might not know. Verbal protocol is, another word is think aloud. So people are thinking online, but you don't know what they're thinking. So that's why I always question, I would say, please slow down, tell me what you're thinking at this moment. So they try to think out loud. So I record them. So I use cognitive map analysis, which is, of course, the old-fashioned qualitative research method. So professor, you might have a better method than that. So this is very old. At my time, this was popular. So I use cognitive map analysis. And then I collected data. So as my son got older, 2014, he's about 20 years old. So I switched my target to college students. So I follow my son's growth, follow my college growth. So then we recruited 500 college students in China and 552 college students in Vietnam. So we did a comparison. We used RASH rating scale model. We found the RASH item reliability, person reliability, item separation, person separation. So that means whether the items measures can distinguish people, can make sure that the high ability people are different from low ability people. So the instrument is the same with text. When you do a test, it makes very easy to understand. For example, math or English language, you can see the test score. If you score high, so that means you are more confident, right, in that content area. In the instrument scale, it's same. We don't use high or low, we use endorsement. So the difficult item, people have less endorsement. And the easy one, people endorse more. Endorse means you choose strongly. So that's why. It's just a different thinking, but the result is the same. So we want to see whether you can separate people from low self-efficacy from high self-efficacy. And then we look at the match between the item difficulty and person ability. I will show you the graphs in a few minutes. So this is a RASH results. It's based probability. So probability means this is the probability of people who choose one. This is the probability of people who choose two. You took statistics also, you know the area under that one shows the probability, right? So you do not want to see a flat. Because the flat one, that means not many people choose that option. That means you have too many categories. So in my instrument, I said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They are almost evenly distributed. So that means there's no need to reduce them to smaller options. So that's why I always keep the 7 categories. So if some people ask me when they develop the instrument, they always ask me how many categories is the best. I said no, there's no answer for that. There's no correct answer to that. You have to collect your data. You have to collect data and see how many items are sufficient. So that's why I keep 7. This is the white chart of this is personal ability, this is the item difficulty. So personal ability, you can understand that people with high self-efficacy, people with low self-efficacy, people with medium self-efficacy. These are most difficult items, these are easiest items. So the standard deviation is here. So this is the mean, this is 1 standard deviation, this is 2 standard deviation. So you try to spread out the people ability and item difficulty. Try to see if the shape of the distribution of the people matches the shape of the distribution of the item difficulties. So this is not ideal. So nothing is perfect. Even though my instrument, I always say, my instrument like my baby, I don't like to criticize it. Still, I admit it's not perfect. That's why you can see there's no high ability, high difficulty items matching the people with high ability. So this is another way to look at them. And this one will show you the item number so that you can see exactly which item is high difficulty, which item is low difficulty. So this is L stands for listening, S stands for speaking, W stands for writing, and R stands for reading. So this is another validity that we did of the question of English second self-efficacy skill. So it shows the item difficulty, we also look at in-fit and out-fit value to see whether the item fit into the categories. It's so similar to the CFA, but different ways to look at them. We also conducted a study with 167 college students in Korea and 265 students from China. So this is to this is for X not X level. So we are generalizing that to different cultures. So Korea and China are also different. For example, in the Chinese survey, I use the word WeChat. So, but in Korea, you cannot use WeChat. They use something different. I forgot, but my Korean colleague told me that it would be something similar to WeChat in Korea. So that's why you have to make sure the item not just translated but also performed. So the results are very satisfactory. So there's a good fit of the two-level form factor model. And then we also did that with another, see the 3 countries, China, Korea, and Vietnam. So I'll tell you, this is very interesting stuff. I'm a very open-minded person. So I only met this person once at a conference. So I did a presentation at a conference in Cambodia. Cambodia is next to Vietnam. There's a lot of people from Vietnam. And this person attended my presentation. We never know each other. They just say, well, your site looks very interesting. Can I work with you? I said, sure, can you help me collect data? Yes, she said yes. She is a college instructor. So she helped me collect data from Vietnam. She said, I said everything you said, which is very amazing. But for me, it's very difficult. It's the most difficult place to collect data is in the US. It's so hard. I give them the incentive. I pay them to respond to my instrument. They're not interested in that. Well, you cannot pay them too much. The IRB, they have to regulate that process. So, but it's very challenging to collect data in the US. That's why I collect more data from other countries, especially Asia.
Quick question about t-test and ANOVA. Could you provide any rationale about why you use t-test and ANOVAs other than using the push-pull-list test and other GLM methods?
Yeah. Okay, so this is based on the distribution of the data. So t-test and ANOVA, you have to use the normal distribution.
Yeah.
You
have a KS test first, right?
Yes.
Before you did the t-test.
Yes. Yeah, but again, that's statistical calls. I could have more conversation with you later. Yeah, so this one we use path analysis. Path analysis is similar to SEM, stratification model. So we look at the path, so correlation between the latent variables instead of the observable variable. T-test question is for observable variables. Normal the same. So we found some positive relationship between these variables, which confirms the aspect of the relationship to other variables. And we also found female Korean students report higher levels of self-efficacy, but not different for Vietnam students. So I also found a recent found. I also collected from German. I think somewhere I mentioned that. So I noticed that Chinese population has changed. In my generation, Chinese people always reported low in self-efficacy. They are very humble, very they always self-evaluate themselves lower than actual value. But nowadays, the young people, the people who were born after 2000, their self-efficacy is high. Am I right? Yeah, your self-efficacy is really high. So I did that. I compared that with German. In the past, if you read the literature, Chinese people always underestimate their self-efficacy. But their performance is better than German students. I compared the German and the US and China. But nowadays, I collect data recently, I found things have changed. The Chinese young people really reported higher self-efficacy than the Germans. So, but I don't know what's happening, but it's really a good sign that our people have become more confident. I know self-efficacy is not the same with confidence, but it's related to confidence. Okay, so another way I use is latent profile analysis. Latent profile analysis is actually the same data. So I just use different approach. So it is legitimate. So some people always ask, can I use the same data for different publications? Sure, you can. you have to develop different research questions. You have to use different data analytical approaches. So that's why I already use that data for other applications, but I use that again for latent profile analysis. The difference is I from completely different angle, because the variable-based approaches, you look at the relationship or differences between the variables or between the groups. But latent profile analysis is based upon person. I look at persons. So actually it's similar to AI. At that time, I did not know the concept of AI. So we put the data together, people's response together, people's performance data, self-report data. We throw all the data together. We ask the computer to run and try to group the students, not group the variables, to group the students. And then we look to see what are the common characteristics of the people who are grouped in this profile, in that profile, in another profile. Then we create a name, which we call it something, so that it can reflect the person, not the variable. That's why it's called variable. It's person based approach. So we found 3 groups. So these are the persons. So you can see that we have a number of classes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We chose 4. The computer will give you, the software will give you different estimations. So you want to stop at a group when you have a reasonable number of groups, and also the important thing, you want to see this one to be the IMI bootstrap method. You want these ABC, these are all goodness of fake indices. You want to make it small. You also want this one entropy value to be large. But again, this one, why you don't have this one? Also, you have to consider the group size. You do not want to have 5 profiles when one of the profiles has a very small sample size. Now, the purpose of that, you want to do follow-up, is you want to do ANOVA, you want to compare the groups. If the group size is small, statistically it will not be significant. That's why you need to stop at the reasonable stage. And that's another way we use our regressions to look at the probability of profiles. What's the probability that students fall into that profile? We look at gender, major, and number of study years. It compares profile 3 versus 2, 4. This is pairwise comparison. So, which is very meaningful approach. So you can see another about writing competence. This is a more recent article. We also put students into 4 profiles. You can see the name. We named them as this profile in efficacy in writing and self-regulation. So we put self-regulation and self-efficacy together. So this is the combination of students with self-efficacy and self-regulation instruments, so that the groups that not only reflect one variable, but reflect 2 variables. So this is the study that I worked with German colleagues. So we collected data from China and Germany, and then we did a CFA, we did a test of invariance, we also did a structural vision modeling. So we consistently, my results are very consistent. I mentioned that self-efficacy has 4 dimensions: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. But for English language, listening, speaking, reading, and writing are always closely related to each other. That's why the 4 dimensions are not very distinct. That's why it has to go 2 levels. But it all falls into the general self-efficacy. So this is the structure of the yes. So this is the self-efficacy, that listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So that's the 32 items for the instrument. For this one, we look at the difference between China and Germany. We look at the test of invariance. We look at CFA for Chinese group and CFA for German group. These are the good fit indexes. I'm sure you learned that in your statistics courses, right? So, and then we look at the model 1, model 2, model 3. So model 1 focus on, so basically you want to make sure, I'll tell you, I used to use 5 steps, but 5 steps is more challenging than 3 steps. 3 steps is easier. So That's why I switched to 3 steps. But technically there are 5 steps. I'll go back and tell you what are the 5 steps are. So look at this one. This is the instrument, right? So the first step, you want to make sure the intercept are equal. So what does intercept mean? I don't know if you think about this question or not. This is a CFA model. CFA model actually consists of multiple regression models. So you can see the arrow, right? So this is the dependent variable. This is the independent variable. And though these are the indicators, the predictors. So you are trying to predict, this is observed variable, right? You are trying to predict observed scores with a latent variable, and then with errors. So this is y equals a. This is a is in the middle is intercept. This is y equals a plus this is b, and that is e. So the errors. So there are 32 regressions. So at the regression y equals a plus bx, a is intercept. So you want to test if the a is the same. The intercept is the same between the 2 samples, between the US, Germany, or Vietnam. So the first step is the intercept are equal. And the second step are the loadings are equal. So loadings means the beats. So these are equal. So for example, in the US it is 0.75. In China you do not want it to be 0.15. Because it's too different, right? If the one is 7.5 and the other is 0.65, it's okay. They cannot be exactly the same. But that's why you need to do a test statistically whether they are different or not. So step 1 is intercept. Step 2 is the weights or the slopes. And then step 3 is error. And the error is the same. And then step 5 is the variance is the same. The variance of the latent factors are the same. And step 5 is the covariance of the latent factors the same. Covariance is relationship are the same. So the 5 steps is old way. It's very, very rigorous. It's very hard. That's why you do the steps. You will see step 1, step 2, step 4. Sometimes you have to release some items. So because your assumption is all the items are the same. All the regression, 32 items are the same. Intercept, slope, error, variance, covariance are the same. This is very demanding. So you always run into an issue that some of them do not fit. When they do not fit, what do? You release some of them. Release means I do not want them to be the same. So that means there's a limitation of the size. There's always a place to write model. So you can say my model seems okay, although some items show some differences. Then we just talk about that. And then in the future studies, we should continue revising this item to make sure consider cultural differences or gender differences. So that's why I did not show you the items. So this is about the past analysis, look at the relationship between self-efficacy, self-relation, and achievement for the Chinese and German students. So I just think I'll give you some introduction to recent studies. I work with my students. So my student, Sun Ting, she was an English teacher of writing. She's from Xi'an, my home city. And she was my student, and she's now at the University of Utah. She's a tenure track assistant professor. So she taught writing for many years. So she followed me, and she said, I want to develop my own instrument. I said, okay. So she's teaching writing. That's why she focused on writing self-efficacy. And then here is also she's from Macau. My doctoral students, Li Jiajing, she's now at Beijing Normal University in Zhuhai. She published with me about self-efficacy vocabulary. This is Yang Yan Chao, I think. Yeah, this is Jing. They are all my students. They all graduated from the University of Macau. So they look familiar to you, right? So they need a pronunciation of then this is a Korean college. This is Vietnam college. So we publish more than that. So public language teaching research. And this is actually my first doctoral student. Her name is Jennifer McGee. So Jennifer McGee was a doctoral student when I was at University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She is now a full professor. So that's why you know how old I am, right? So my student had become a full professor. She is a full professor at the Appalachian State University. So she did that for the self-advocacy teaching mathematics. So they follow my self-advocacy, but they always different from me. But they focus on one of area that they are good at. So she was a math teacher. And then this is another student. She's focused on preschool, teacher sense of teaching, self-advocacy. And this one mathematics, vocabulary, and this one homework, set skill. So you can see that I have done quite a lot of work on self-advocacy related skill instrument. That's why it's my great honor. I'd like to share my experience with you. And I'm also very happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.